There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from realizing that fewer people ask how you're really doing, and even fewer stay long enough to hear the honest answer. If that feels familiar, stay with me. Micro hook. Some loneliness arrives quietly, after a lifetime of giving. 1. The loneliness that shows up after a full life. Most people think loneliness arrives when life falls apart. But the loneliness that comes with age often appears after a life that was full, after years of being needed, after mornings that began for others, after putting your own feelings second or last. And then one day, nothing dramatic happens. You wake up, you move through the day, your body still works, your mind still remembers, yet something feels different. You notice fewer questions, shorter conversations, less curiosity about how you really are. Not because you've lost value, but because the world quietly assumes you no longer need to be checked on. Loneliness often begins the moment people stop asking. Not because you're unworthy, but because you've been strong for too long. You don't complain about this. You don't put words to it. You tell yourself, this is just how it is now. So you carry the feeling alone, not loudly, not visibly, just quietly, in the spaces no one thinks to look. And that quiet is heavier than most people realize. 2. When no one asks anymore, there comes a quiet moment when people stop asking. Not all at once, not intentionally. It happens slowly. They assume you're settled. They assume you've learned how to manage. They assume, after everything you've lived through, you no longer need much attention. And maybe you notice it first in small ways. Questions don't linger. Conversations move on quickly. No one really waits for your answer. Being assumed okay can feel lonelier than being completely alone. At first, you still try. You offer a little honesty, a longer answer, but you feel the shift, the impatience, the subtle discomfort. So you adapt. You shorten your words. You soften your truth. You tell people what's easiest to hear. Not because you're hiding, but because you're tired of explaining a life they no longer slow down to understand. So you nod, you smile, you say, I'm fine. And loneliness grows, not from the lack of people, but from standing right in front of them and slowly disappearing without anyone noticing. That kind of loneliness stays with you long after the conversation ends. 3. The shame no one talks about. There is a quiet shame that often sits beside loneliness. A shame most people never admit, not even to themselves. Because you've lived a long life. You've handled hard things. You've survived losses that once felt unbearable. So when loneliness appears, you don't see it as pain. You see it as failure. Loneliness feels embarrassing when you believe strength should have erased it by now. You tell yourself, I shouldn't still need people. I've already been through worse. Others are truly alone, not me. And in doing so, you minimize your own ache. You push it down. You tuck it away behind gratitude and quiet endurance. But pain doesn't disappear just because you reason with it. It doesn't leave because you compare it to someone else's suffering. It simply grows quieter. And the quieter it becomes, the harder it is to explain, even when someone finally asks. So the shame deepens. Not because loneliness is wrong, but because you were never taught that needing connection is allowed at every age. And that misunderstanding can be heavier than the loneliness itself. 4. When memories become heavier than plans. There was a time when the future felt crowded. Crowded with invitations, with phone calls, with reasons to get dressed and go. You looked ahead and saw movement. Now, when you look forward, the days feel quieter. And when you look back, the memories arrive all at once. When memories begin to outweigh anticipation, loneliness settles in gently, and then stays. You remember conversations that once filled entire evenings. People who knew your routines, your tone of voice, the way your mood changed before you ever spoke. And sometimes, what you miss isn't only them. You miss the version of yourself who was expected, relied on, needed without asking. There is a particular ache in realizing that the calendar is lighter, not because life lost meaning, but because your role in it quietly changed. That grief doesn't demand attention. It sits softly in the background, showing up in quiet afternoons, in pauses between tasks, in moments when there's no next plan waiting. It is subtle, but it is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged, not rushed past. 5. Why you grew quieter. You didn't grow quieter because you ran out of things to say. You grew quieter because you noticed what happened when you did speak. People listened halfway. They interrupted. They hurried you along. So slowly, you adjusted. Silence is often learned. After your words stopped being received, you learned which thoughts were too much, which stories took too long, which feelings made others uncomfortable. So you shortened your sentences. You softened your truth. You learned how to comfort yourself instead of reaching out, and the world praised you for it. You were easy to be around, independent, low maintenance. But inside, something never quite finished forming. A sentence left unsaid. An emotion without a place to land. Not because it wasn't important, but because there was nowhere safe to put it. So the quiet grew, not as emptiness, but as a container holding everything you never stopped feeling. 6. Loneliness is not the enemy. Loneliness is usually spoken about as something that needs to be fixed, as if it were a problem, a flaw, something you failed to outgrow. But loneliness is not your enemy. It didn't arrive to punish you. It arrived to speak. Loneliness doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means something inside you still cares. It means your heart hasn't shut down. It still notices what's missing. It still reaches for depth instead of noise. That longing didn't disappear with age. It became more precise. You no longer want distractions. You want honesty, presence, moments that feel real. Loneliness shows up when those things are absent, not to weaken you, but to remind you of what truly matters now. So instead of pushing it away, consider this. Loneliness is not asking you to change who you are. It's asking you to listen more closely to what your heart is quietly requesting. And that request, no matter your age, is worth honoring. 7. The connection you actually long for. You don't miss being surrounded by people. You miss being known, not in a loud way, not through constant conversation, but in the quiet details. Someone who notices when you pause mid-sentence, when your energy changes, when your smile arrives a little later than usual. True connection is felt long before it is ever explained. You don't want to be the center of attention. You're not looking to be entertained. You want recognition, to be seen without performing, to be understood without having to justify your feelings. And when that kind of presence is missing, loneliness deepens. Not because you are alone, but because no one is truly meeting you where you are. That longing isn't weakness, it's discernment. It comes from a life that has learned the difference between noise and meaning, between being surrounded and being understood. And the fact that you still long for that depth is not something to apologize for. It's wisdom speaking softly, asking for connection that feels real. 8. What aging really reveals. Aging doesn't make you invisible. What it does is remove the distractions that once kept you busy. The noise fades, the rushing stops, and what's left is what was always there. Aging doesn't shrink the heart. It strips away what never mattered. You no longer chase approval. You no longer perform for attention. You start listening to what feels true. And when that truth isn't reflected back to you, when conversations stay shallow, when presence feels absent, loneliness appears. Not as a punishment, not as a sign you failed, but as a signal. It shows you that your heart has grown more honest, more selective. You're not asking for less from life. You're asking for what matters. And that can feel isolating in a world that still moves fast and listens slowly. But this stage of life is not about becoming smaller. It's about becoming clearer. And the clarity you're carrying deserves to be met with the same depth you now offer so naturally. 9. You are not too late. There may be a quiet part of you that wonders if the time for connection has already passed, if the meaningful conversations belong to another season of life, if now you're simply meant to manage on your own. It is never too late to be understood, only harder when you believe it is. Depth does not follow a schedule. It doesn't expire. It doesn't belong to youth. It belongs to honesty. You don't need many people around you. You never did. What you've always needed is one place, one moment, where you don't have to perform, where you don't have to simplify yourself, where silence doesn't feel awkward, where your presence is enough. Connection at this stage of life is not about starting over. It's about allowing yourself to be met as you are now. Not who you used to be, not who you were expected to remain, and the courage to believe that this kind of connection is still possible. That belief alone can soften the loneliness more than you might expect. The heart of healing. Heart Talks. If this video felt like someone quietly sitting beside you for a moment, let that be enough for tonight. You don't need to fix the loneliness. You don't need to explain it or make sense of it right now. Just notice it, gently. You are still here, still aware, still capable of feeling deeply. And that matters, even in the quiet, especially in the quiet. As long as this space exists, as long as these words reach you, you are not unseen. You are not forgotten. You don't have to carry everything alone. Not here.